Everybody, welcome to the Development Committee, 22nd of November 2018. As usual, our emergency evacuation announcement. Should we be required to evacuate the building, would you please leave the building via the nearest available exit to the chamber. Our assembly point will be in the public car park at the side of the Civic Suite. Please don't delay your evacuation to collect any belongings, and please don't return into the building until given permission to do so by council staff. Please also note that the meeting will be audio recorded. Item 1 is apologies for absence. They've been received from Councillor Iano. And item 2, substitute members, that's Councillor Lucas Gill. Non-members attending, Councillor Mr Hoy. Item 4, minutes of the meeting held on the 18th of October 2018. You're happy for me to sign those as a correct and accurate record of that meeting? Thank you. Declarations of interest. Mrs Hoy, Councillor Mrs Hoy. Okay, thank you. Councillor Mr Hoy.
The same as Councillor Mrs Hoy, so
Okay,
a non-pecuniary interest. Thank you. On item 9.
Councillor Williams.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, non-pecuniary interest on item 8 as being a portfolio holder for the environment.
Thank you. Members, we've had... Oh. Councillor Mrs Hoy, was it pecuniary or non-pecuniary?
No, what it is.
And the nature of the interest? Okay, thank you. Members, there is an addendum that's been published and circulated. Has everyone seen that and had proper chance to digest the contents? Yeah, right, thank you very much. Right, item 6 is land between Star Lane and Alexandra Road, south of High Street, Great Wakering.
Oh, thank you, Chairman.
Press it in the middle. Just press it. Is it got an... Yeah? Press it, yeah.
Apologies about that. Okay, the application site is located outside the settlement of Great Wakering. The application site outlined it in red, if you can see. Outline red here, kind of in the middle of the site. On the plan before you illustrates that the site forms part of a wider site currently under construction known as Star Lane Phase 2, which is outlined in blue, so that's the bold line around the edge of the site. To the west, the site is bounded by Star Lane Industrial Estate, beyond which is Star Lane. To the southwest is a former Star Lane Brickworks, which is now a housing development, presently under construction by Taylor Wimpey, East London. Directly south of the application site is Star Lane Pits, which are designated as a local wildlife site. To the east is an area scrubland. Onto the site layout plan. Planning permission is being sought for the construction of 78 dwellings. 58 of these dwellings have previously been considered. These plots are either being plot substituted or reorientated. These changes proposed would enable 20 additional dwellings on site. Number of dwellings on this site would increase from 180 to 200 dwellings over the entire Phase 2 development. The principle for residential-led development and the site access was established within the outline planning permission. These matters are therefore not subject to further assessment. The site is divided into character areas following the design guide previously approved at the reserved matter stage. The 78 dwellings would comprise 2 or 2.5 stories in height and a mix of 1 to 5 bedroom dwellings, which is distributed across the site. The layout provides a density of 29 dwellings per hectare. In terms of design, the appearance, scale, bulk and height and layout would follow on from Phase 2, resulting in a cohesive form of development. The dwellings proposed meets the national space standards, as well as providing adequate private amenity space, measuring in accordance with the Council's SPD2 housing design. There is adequate back-to-back distances between existing and proposed dwellings, as well as adequate side-to-side distances. The layout would not result in overlooking, overshadowing or over-dominance on the private amenity space of the existing and proposed dwellings. The proposed development provides a level of car parking that is in accordance with the public car parking standards and will meet the demands of the future occupiers whilst also providing adequate car parking for visitors. The proposed dwellings would not result in a demonstrable harm upon the wider development nor the surrounding character and appearance of the area. The proposal would not cause an impact upon the amenity of surrounding neighbouring properties, nor would it pose a threat to future occupants, and provides car parking provision that would not be detrimental to highway safety. It is therefore considered that the proposed development is compliant with policies of Rochester District Council, Local Development Framework, EPOA parking standards and the NPPF. It is recommended that committee resolve the planning permission be approved, subject to a deed of variation to Section 106. The variation to Section 106 relates to affordable housing. The increase in 20 additional dwellings will result in 7 additional affordable units. 70 affordable units would be available across the entire site, compliant with 35% required by council policy. These units would be split 80-20. 6 of these units would be social rented and 1 would be immediate housing compliant with the council policy. Open space, the developer has agreed to a £25,000 contribution towards existing play space in Great Wakering. This sum is expected to be paid prior to first occupation of the 78 dwellings within the red line of the application site. Education, a proportionate increase towards early years and children, primary and secondary education, and secondary transport is required for the additional 20 dwellings, as well as the habitat regulations assessments. As detailed in the addendum before you, the council, as competent authority, has carried out a habitat regulation assessment and requires £100 per dwelling, which is 20 in total. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a speaker on this one, Mr. Caslin. Just turn his microphone on. Maximum 5 minutes when you're ready.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, councillors. I do not wish to repeat anything from the officer's presentation, so I'll try and keep this brief. The replan of Star Lane that you are considering this evening is necessitated by a number of factors at the site, and the application in front of you is a result of detailed discussions with officers at Rochester District Council. Whilst we are on the whole pleased with progress on site at Star Lane, sales over recent months have been below expectations. The most popular house type by far are the 3-bedroom properties, whilst the larger 4-bedroom units have proven to be extremely difficult to sell. This is therefore not simply a case of increasing the capacity to increase revenue, but a replan to be responsive to the market and provide the types of homes that people actually want to live in. In doing so, this makes for a more suitable development that also further satisfies the broader objectives of the National Planning Policy Framework. Aside from the benefits of providing more appropriate and much-needed homes, there are also additional benefits for the wider area. 7 of the additional homes will be affordable, provided in social rent and intermediate offer. We will also be able to revisit the legal agreement for the scheme and have already informally agreed to a significant contribution towards open space improvements at the existing nearby recreation ground. Proportionate education contributions will also be made should you be mindful to approve the scheme. The plans satisfy all policy requirements on highway capacity, car parking, space standards, and including a private amenity. The scheme was originally designed to be relatively loose in form, and whilst density and capacity has increased in the replan, it remains a relatively low density scheme at 29.3 dwellings per hectare. This does bring the scheme more in line with local policy DM2, whilst also satisfying the NPPF's wider requirements to make the most efficient use of site allocations. We have now built over 100 new homes as part of the first phase and employed a vast number of local people in the process. We hope that Taylor Wimpey have fully demonstrated how seriously we take our commitment to managing the construction stage in order to be the best possible neighbours to existing residents. Granted, it has not been easy with a particularly warm summer, but where issues have arisen, we have been quick to respond and rectify them. We hope to continue to build on this work we have completed so far in Great Wakering and continue to invest in the local workforce. We want to ensure the scheme is successful as it can be, and the replan will help to achieve this. Thank you again, and I look forward to listening to the debate.
Thank you. Councillor Steptoe.
Thank you, Chairman. Point of clarification as much as anything, please. On looking at the drawing there, to the north top corner of where the development site is, there's an access way through to the high street. What I'd like to do is to clarify whether that will be opened up as part of this project once the site is occupied, because that comes out on the main high street, right opposite or just adjacent to the doctor's surgery, bus stops, and all the other amenities, it doesn't really come into this development site here, but I would like to propose that that is the case, because otherwise the group of people that will be living in that development site will be completely cut off from the high street.
I think that's quite challenging because it's not actually part of the application that we're discussing, but if you'd like to...
Yeah, that access onto the high street is emergency access only. There are pedestrian walkthroughs, so people can access the high street via foot, or like I say, it's an emergency access only for vehicles.
Right. Yes?
Just to clarify, I did mean for pedestrian and cyclists, so that will be happening as part of that project. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hookway.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I'd just like to ask, obviously this adjustment to the original scheme increases the number of dwellings. Is it also a corresponding increase in the number of bed spaces? What is the comparison between bed spaces to the original scheme and bed spaces to this scheme?
It will increase bed spaces, but I don't actually have to hand how many bed spaces it will increase by. In the addendum, there is a table which outlines the dwellings and what was previously proposed, private and affordable, and how many dwellings are being proposed now, private and affordable. But it doesn't actually refer to the bed spaces specifically. So I don't actually have that answer to give you.
Okay, that's fair enough.
But it would increase the bed spaces, of course.
Do you want to come back before we move on?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I think this, although it may seem a minor point, it's quite relevant in respect of how the impact it has. Obviously, the number of people living on the site, you know, how many more people are likely to be living on the site as opposed to what was originally proposed.
Yeah, I mean, I think in respect of the increased number of people living on the site, yes, there's an increased number of bed spaces. We don't know the exact figure, and the policy looks for contributions to, and the Section 106 is going to deal with additional education contributions and the like that would be linked to that increase on the site. But we say all in all that there's a appropriate amount of open space that's provided, and this application also seeks to address the contribution towards the play space in the sort of wider locality.
Okay. That's Lucas Gill.
Thank you, Chairman. Can I refer to item 6.3 on page 6.11, the reference to physical security from Essex Police? Will this be pushed forward?
Those comments will have been put forward to the agents, so they are aware of the comments from Essex Police. It's a matter between the applicant and Essex Police to resolve those issues, because it refers to design and safety. So, like I say, the applicant is aware of it, and it's down to them to have those discussions with the police in terms of maybe putting some mitigation in regarding sort of whether it's on street safety, obviously, whether it be more lighting, etc. But the applicant is aware of that.
No one.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I've just thought of something else. I may have missed it in the report as possible when I was going through there. Sorry, yes, it may be something that I might have missed in the report when I was going through it. When this came before us before, the developers took some things on board when we were in discussions with them in the pre-application period. One of which was to make the site hedgehog friendly. I'm just wondering as to whether this adjustment has any bearing on that, or whether it still meets our requirements of a hedgehog friendly site.
It will be hedgehog friendly. I have seen within the ecology statement that's been submitted as part of this application that the previous ecology report has been adopted and they will be following that, which allows for holes within fences for hedgehogs to pass through freely. This will also be carried forward into this development as well, so it will again be hedgehog friendly.
Okay, members. Because we've on a previous occasion had significant debate about the principle of this. This is essentially what we're looking at here is, do the additional 20 units fit within that scheme? And I think we've had that, the officer's case clearly made to us. So there's a recommendation for approval, starting on 6.1 and going through, plus the revision on the addendum regarding the section 106. So can I ask those members in favour of approval, please indicate. That's full house then. That item is approved. Thank you very much. Item 7, Cherry Orchard Brickworks, Cherry Orchard Lane, Rochford.
Thank you.
Please listen very carefully, this first bit.
Just the location plan line. Actually, sorry, the Bing image should bring up. Members, officers you'll see on the addendum recommend that this application be deferred to enable the applicant to provide further information with respect to two specific matters relating to surface water drainage and the habitat regulations. With respect to surface water drainage, there is an expectation that major development will incorporate surface water drainage through sustainable urban drainage systems. Details of the proposed drainage have been submitted with the proposal, but Essex County Council lead local flood authority team has raised a holding objection requiring submission of further information. With respect to the habitat regulations, Natural England are a statutory consultee to the application, and in their consultation response advised that a habitat regulations assessment should be carried out because of cumulative impact of the additional housing that could have an impact on the district's coastline that's subject to European wildlife legislation. No such habitat regulation assessment has been carried out, but the applicants have been made aware of this and would like some time to address this matter. Officers have advised the applicant that the officer recommendation would likely remain one of refusal for the reasons set out in the Development Committee report, but officers consider that it is reasonable to allow the applicant additional time to address the two matters above, which may be resolved with the submission of additional information, including mitigation. So the recommendation from officers, Chairman, is deferral of this item.
And I'm happy to move that recommendation for deferral from the chair. So members, if you want to have a debate in this first instance, it's simply about whether we defer or not. Or I'm happy to just go to a vote on that one. Okay, so we've listened to the officer's recommendation for deferring this item for further information to be gathered. Now just have those members in favour of deferring this item, please indicate. Thank you very much. That item's deferred. Possibly January, February? January. Okay. Thank you for coming. Right.
Can you take it to the location plan?
Item 8 is public conveniences, Crown Hill in Rayleigh.
So members, this application relates to this site here, edged in bold, on the location plan. It's the old public toilet building at the top of Crown Hill, close to the junction with the High Street. Opposite the site is a public house. South of the site are some commercial premises fronting the High Street. Immediately to the sort of rear of the site is a commercial building in use as a gym and shop. And then further north, down Crown Hill, the locality is largely residential in character. If I can take you to the photo of the building that we have. So this building is within Rayleigh Conservation Area, and the building itself is locally listed. No external changes to the building are proposed, so the proposal would have no adverse impact on the character and appearance of the conservation area. I can take you to the elevation plans. The application seeks to change the use of the building to allow for flexible uses, either as a retail shop, use within the financial, professional services, for example, as an estate agent, a restaurant, cafe, a hot food takeaway, or as an office, including light industrial use. See, the floor area proposed is just taking out all of the toilet-related equipment. The floor area is modest at some 40 square metres, and it's just one internal space. The building is located within Rayleigh Town Centre, where policies within the Rayleigh Centre Area Action Plan apply. This plan seeks to promote Rayleigh as the main town centre within the district and supports planning applications which propose uses appropriate to this aim. The action plan identifies primary and secondary shopping areas within the town centre where there is policy support for consolidation and strengthening of retail development, but the application site lies outside of these specific town centre designations, and as a consequence there's no policy emphasis on securing only retail uses in this location. It is in this location any uses which support the vitality and viability of the town centre are to be supported, and any of the proposed uses would fulfil this purpose and are considered acceptable. Subject to the recommended planning conditions, if you could go back to the location plan, you'll remember that there's a couple of dwellings just north of the site. A replacement toilet block is immediately north of the site, beyond which are some residential properties. We accept in this general location on the edge of the town centre that there is some level of evening sort of uses that happen, but to protect the nearby residential uses, some conditions are imposed, specifically restricting the use to close at 11:30 p.m. So subject to the recommended planning conditions, officers recommend approval of the proposed development.
Councillor Steptoe.
Thank you, Chairman. Just really a bit of clarification. With the use that this building has previously had and the likely use for, say, something like kitchen or restaurant, is there any special requirements for, shall we say, deep cleaning the property?
I think I think we're possibly going off the planning issues, but I think there'd be an obvious need, a perceived need there.
Chairman, perhaps we'll just leave that to the planning regulations.
Yeah, building control, yes, and they want to get their score of 5 on the door. Councillor Griffin.
Thank you, Chairman. You say the building's in the conservation area. Is it only just in the conservation area? I thought the boundary was Crown Hill.
I've marked it on my plan, and what it does is it goes, the conservation area boundary, so it goes across the road here, and then it's been extended, so it takes in this side of Crown Hill, around the church, and then around this sort of open space here. So it incorporates all of this bit, so it's not immediately on the edge of the conservation area here, and then it goes along the back here and round.
Was that a fairly recent extension of the conservation area?
It was a couple of years ago, I think.
Right, okay. Right, thanks very much.
Is it Councillor Mrs Hoy?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, basically it's going to be used for food, hot food and drinks or whatever. So I'm referring to the refuge. Can you explain to me where the bins are going to be?
So the thought process here is that this is quite a small plan, so it's quite difficult to tell, but there is some space to the rear of the building, and there's some space to the front. But if we go back to the picture at the front, you'll see that it's kind of landscaped at the front, and there's no plan to sort of change that necessarily. So there's a couple of options. There's a condition that requires the applicant to provide details of where bins are going to be stored. So what we would do is seek to ensure that they're not put in front of the building, because that's going to have a bit of a detrimental impact on the character of that particular locality. So there's a couple of options. The site immediately north is under the ownership of the council as well, as far as I'm aware. And so there is potentially a ability to access the rear of the site through this site. Alternatively, there's potential for, and if we go to the floor plan, please. So at the moment, there isn't an access door through there, okay? But it doesn't mean to say you couldn't put one in to enable sort of bins to be brought forward, if necessary, for collection at a suitable point in time. So there is potential for another application to come in to put another doorway in to allow access to the rear of the site.
So if whoever has it will have to provide
Yes, they do, and it's conditioned, so they'd have to supply details to us for us to agree before they went ahead and used that building. Yeah.
Okay, Councillor Hookway, final one.
Thank you, Chairman. You said in your report that the frontage of the building there's no alteration intended to the frontage at all.
Principle of the usage we're talking about here.
Yeah. So with regard to if it's going to be for commercial use, is there any limitation or restriction on signage on the building?
Yes, so any signage that a potential occupier wants to put onto that building would have to comply with the advert regulations, the advertisement regulations. There is deemed consent for some advertising on buildings, and it's quite prescriptive, so the advertisement regulations are quite lengthy. We haven't got any adverts specifically proposed at the moment, but what an potential end user would need to do is consider what advertising they want, consider whether it's got deemed consent already. That wouldn't include any illuminated advertising on this building, given that it's in the conservation area. So anything like that would need to come before the council for a decision. So whilst there might be some potential for some advertising that's got deemed consent, essentially deemed consent advertisement is deemed appropriate anyway in conservation areas, and the lettering is restricted and the size of the advertising is restricted as well. But we may well see an application submitted for advertising.
Can I come back on the point? Yes, as I was saying about there's no alteration to the frontage. So if someone occupied it and then they wanted to make any alteration, that would require a planning permission, I presume, then?
Yep, so because it's not a dwelling house, so there's no permitted development, but if, so the assessment is, would any user want to make a material alteration to that building? So potentially, if you want to change the appearance of which could include new windows and the like, if it makes a material alteration to the building, that would need planning consent, and so that would need to be an application that was submitted.
Right. Okay, Councillor Weston, final one then. I think it's a...
Thank you, Chairman. This is probably going to be a difficult one anyway. You've got here about no deliveries between 7 and 23:30 of an evening, which obviously we know full well that delivery drivers never adhere to these. What are you going to put in place? I'm concerned about this because where it is, it's not far from the pedestrian crossing and traffic lights. And if you're going to have someone who uses it as a cafe or something like that, they're going to have deliveries. So what's really going to be put in place is that the drivers are not going to be parking at those times of day. It will cause horrendous issues, especially up that road.
Go on, I'll let you do it, Xan.
So condition 5 is recommended. The rationale is to sort of try to ensure that the end user here and the end use doesn't have an adverse impact on residential amenity of the properties further down Crown Hill. But we accept that it is a town centre location. So it restricts the use and then also deliveries to not outside of the hours of 7 a.m. and 11:30 p.m. And as with any planning condition, the enforcement is sometimes difficult. Doesn't mean it's not possible, but what it does mean in these sort of circumstances is officers, if these restrictions aren't being adhered to, is understanding information that's probably relayed to us from members of the public or members getting complaints, and then investigating it and trying to, find instances where it's not being adhered to. Obviously, that's after having spoken to the owner and explaining the need for them to ensure that these are met and that the deliveries are,
And
as
also,
far as possible, restricted to
within
these hours.
50 metres, there is a commercial delivery bay on the high street as well. So, right, members, it's just the principle of whether the former toilets can have an alternative use in this case. So those members in favour of the recommendation printed on 8.1, please indicate. Was that a... Yeah, thank you. That was a full house then. Thank you. Right. Our final item tonight, 9.1, is a referred item, land to the rear of 145 to 149 Ferry Road, Holmbridge. And our presentation on this one, Mr. Stranks.
Thank you, Chairman. This application is on to correct the report, the western side of Ferry Road. You'll see going north-south here. Our site is adjoining this zebra crossing here and relates to this building and this land area at the back. The larger building you'll see on the site there already is a former shop building, quite a large building, as you'll see amongst a group of other similar sized buildings, that has been converted to 7 flats, which are existing occupied, but there is an 8th flat under construction. If we can jump to the topographic plan, please. Thank you. Just to, if members can see some of the details, but the zebra crossing is out here. The building that's already present is here with some outbuildings. Members may just be able to see, at least at the time of the survey. The access goes down this side, number 147, which contributes at the bottom of its garden to the site edge red. Is there. You'll see that one of the characteristics of the site is a number of trees that are on the site, and you'll have seen from your report that the council's arboriculturalist has considered the submissions of the applicant, their arboriculturalist, and agrees those findings, that those trees are in varying condition, of particularly poor in nature, that wouldn't amount to justifying retention or preservation. In fact, there's 2 trees on this boundary that are dangerous and ought to be felled, and there's a further tree on this location that's got a disease that you'll see is set out in the report. If we can go to the superseded layout. Chairman, there were revisions to this application. You'll see this is the layout that first came in. We see the existing building, and what interests us is at this end of the site. You'll see the 2 bungalows proposed, both 1-bedroom bungalows proposed here, but of interest is this extensive car parking area. It's not often that we ask an applicant to reduce the car parking. What I think the philosophy was with the applicant was to try and get full compliance, which you'll see is possible on the site, but it didn't need to do so because the scheme that was approved here under the earlier parking standards provided basically 1 space per flat, and the applicant was interested in increasing that, but officers felt it was unnecessary because the previous scheme had an approval for just the 9 spaces or so. So a reduction was sought, where these spaces here were moved together with, I think it's the cycle or bin store, down into this more central area convenient to the building, and that improved the relationship on that side. If we can go to the revised layout, this is the layout that members are concerned with tonight. This is the application that's before you for a decision, and you'll see that the car parking area has been reduced. There is an error in part of the report, but corrected later. You'll see referred to 11 spaces. This is actually 14, 13 at the rear, and an additional space in the front of the building, the existing building. And what the applicant also did was he slightly changed the layout, increasing an extra window on the back, but mainly to provide independent garden spaces. The scheme that was first approved had a communal roaming garden area around all the buildings to do with everybody on the site. It was felt that the application could be improved by having independent space to serve the 2 bungalows proposed. Now you'll see from the report that it's actually under size, but the communal garden area over here is a surplus, and you'll see that it's set out in the report to you that the difference between these shortfalls is more than made up by the surplus on the communal side. If members were concerned about that and felt that the garden area should be to your standard, if only for its own sake, all the applicant would do would move the fence dividing these 2 over a little bit and create more land to the garden area to this unit here. So he can achieve full compliance, but officers, having considered that these sites are usable, these garden areas are usable, and the communal area has a better relationship to all concerned, on balance felt that it wasn't necessary to make that correction. If I can talk to you about the parking areas, there is a correction to paragraph 59 of the officer's report. You'll see that we refer to the car parking spaces to be 2.5 by 5. They're actually the old standard that followed the layout to approving these in the 2000s, where the spaces are 4.8 by 2.4. Now, whilst that is below your minimum standard, you'll see there is some overrun areas, and these are 2 disabled spaces. But because the previous approvals were to a lower standard, officers feel in this case that it's justified to accept that 4.8 by 2.4 size. That is still consistent, although it's in slight conflict with the county standards that you adopt, it is consistent with the national standards that are applied across the country. I've mentioned about the garden areas and the shortfall can make up. Now, the members will be aware that policy H1 to your core strategy requires that backland developments normally considered unacceptable and squeezed in. It requires them to have a good relationship to the site surroundings. Now you'll see that the access that goes down this side of the main building that's already serving 8 households, it's already in place, so we only have the intensity of 2 extra dwellings, 2 one-bedroom, they're double bedrooms, but 2 dwellings on the back. And given the size of the buildings that are in the front and then the houses that back onto the side at the back, there is really a transition in built form between the very large former commercial properties on this side and some residential here to the housing, more strong housing character at the back of the site. So on balance, officers feel that if we can look at the house types, that these buildings, which are modest in scale, they've got hipped roofs, not unlike large garages. The pyramid type roof has lesser form, and officers consider that this is an acceptable design in that relationship to those surroundings. But you'll see from the recommendation it is necessary that if members are minded to approve it, that you'd have to remove permitted development rights, we feel, on this occasion for further extensions and particularly rooms in the roof. The rooms in the roof may or may not be technically possible, but you'll be aware that the government is or has considered whether to change PD rights to allow lifting of the roofs. So as a matter of housekeeping, officers support the idea of removing the PD rights for these 2 dwellings. Before I move to the recommendation, Chairman, there is one further submission we've had since the addendum was produced. It's not addressed, but I do need to read it to you. It says, further to our previous comments relating to the above planning application, our position remains the same. We are totally opposed to the building of these 2 bungalows at the rear of our garden in Elm Grove for all the reasons mentioned in our last email. It would also appear updated plans have also recently been submitted, which we'd like some clear clarification on these, as they indicate further elevations which from our point of view would be totally unacceptable. I urgently await further comments. Chairman, the recommendation is approval subject to the conditions that are set out in the report.
Thank you. Have a speaker, Mrs. Leach, on this one. If you sit, feel free to sit down if you want, or you just turn the microphone on. Up to 5 minutes, I'll let you know when you've got use of all.
Okay. Good evening. I speak on behalf of the residents of Elm Grove and also 149 Ferry Road. I firstly raise the point that the owners of 149 Ferry Road are in consultation with their solicitor with regard to a potential boundary dispute that has been raised. the said boundary be between 149 and 147. The boundary of 149 and the north side of the development at present is separated by trees that were first deemed to be on the site of 149 Ferry Road. I understand that the boundary has been moved to the benefit of the owners of 147, and if successful, I consider that the land regained by 149 would reduce the available land available to development quite considerably. The plans indicate the removal of the said trees, and the loss of the trees would impact on the privacy of the owners of 149 considerably. It would also be impossible for the owners of 149 to build their own screen of trees, as their swimming pool is in situ to the boundary with no scope to plant. I also note that 149 Ferry Road remains noted on the application despite it being raised previously that the owners of that property are not making the planning application. For me, this raises further questions about around whose land the application is actually being made on. If we look at the aerial photo of the property, we see the ambiguous pattern of the boundary, and actually, you know, from my part, you can see where there's been a garage built at the top and part of the garden has been taken. I concur that the proposed dwellings would be an overdevelopment of the area, and they would be incongruous and an alien form of development that would not be well integrated into the local built environment, and so would be a discordant feature that would detract from the character and appearance of the area and does not conform to the regular street pattern, and in conflict with the core strategy, policy H1 and HP6 of the Rochford District Plan. I consider it to be an unacceptable form of backland development that goes against the policy guidelines regarding building in back gardens. This, I think, if this passes, it will take a precedent. Actually, there's a lot of land that's just left behind all those houses that could open the gateway for a complete estate to be put in between the Ferry Road and Elm Grove. I would argue also that there is no need for backland development due to the 500 plus homes already passed by yourselves in Holbridge. We also consider that the proposed development is situated too close to the boundary of the surrounding properties, would impact on privacy with an increase of noise and disturbance. I think also the being projected going up into the roofs of the houses also, that would also impact on us more greater than we even believed before, because, you know, that would be overlooked completely then. There would be noise and disturbance, having effectively a car park adjoining our back garden. The headlights shining into our bedroom windows as vehicles drive into the development would also affect us greatly and cause us much disturbance. The additional vehicles associated with this development would have an adverse effect on local movement of traffic and would raise for me safety concerns, as the vehicles would have difficulty in turning round within the development and so would need to reverse out to the main road and by the zebra crossing. Restricted access also raises safeguarding concerns in respect of the difficulties emergency vehicles would have in accessing the properties. And if you see the photo that's been submitted, there was an incident where actually an emergency vehicle had to get into that property and had great difficulty, as you can see by the photo taken, trying to get down to the side. With 2 bungalows in that backland development, I do question, that's an ambulance. How could a fire engine get down there? And I'm presuming there'd be disabled people there, perhaps elderly people living in the bungalows, quite frequently the need for ambulances. I don't think that is acceptable. Right. If we also look at the photo, flooding remains an issue. There's some photos of the back garden. 147 is elevated, and so these photos here of actual flooding that's occurred because of the 147 sits behind that fence that sort of acts as a dam for that garden. So I don't know how the flooding could be rectified. I don't know if there's any plans or... Thank you. I say parking, number of spaces. Potentially you could have quite a number of people living in those flats. I don't think the parking's adequate. That could spill onto the surrounding areas. And I'm also concerned for the people that actually live in there already, because they're actually living in the building site, actual buildings and being undertaken inside their flats while they're living there. I don't think that's acceptable in this day and age. Okay. Also, I'm concerned about the abusive process. We had no idea that this meeting was going to go on this evening. It was only that my neighbour saw on the website. We had no formal notification that actually this was going to be that the report had been given. So I don't really find that's acceptable either. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Mr Hoy.
Thank you, Chairman. There's just 2 or 3 points I'd like to raise on this one, if I may. Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to start with the amenity space. Amenity space should be usable, and we do state that in our policy, usable as amenity space. I understand that and correct me if I'm wrong, please, I'm sure you will do, that the amenity space we're showing as usable is the actual gardens. We are excluding the bits to the side and to the backs of the bungalows themselves, and we are just, the amenity space is just the squares in front of...
Point at it, just for clarity.
...the properties. So we are excluding the bit to the side and the edge when we talk about the 41 square metres and the...
If I may, Chairman, we exclude this area.
Yes.
But we're including, the test is, could you sit out in it?
Yeah,
So the narrow metre side space that is normally just there to give the buildings an adequate setting, they're really little more than walkways. But if it's wider than a walkway, it can be included. So we've measured these sort of almost L-shaped areas behind the buildings.
Thank you, but you're excluding the one on the far side. Thank you. And on that basis, I still contend that the amenity space isn't usable to the extent it should be. That the amenity space is to the rear of the plot. It's quite a distance from the flats, and the flats are the main users of the amenity space. The amenity space itself is the area goes directly to the edge of the bungalows, underneath their windows, looking at the plans. So in reality, that is not usable. You can't expect people to be playing underneath the bungalows or young children. To me, this is where the usable space has to be applied, and I contend that that is not usable. On the second point, I'm going back to the parking, because obviously I did note the parking sizes which were put in the report. Minimum parking standards are 2.9 by 5.5 metres, but we are allowed to have a minimum space, exceptionally, of 2.5 by 5 metres. And we actually say that any less than that makes the spaces not usable. I paraphrase slightly, I must admit. Just because parking spaces of a smaller size may have been passed on an earlier application which had different standards does not mean, in my opinion, that we should keep those minimum standards which now are outdated. We should try and modernise and update, and we should preferably have 2.9 by 5.5, but as I've been told previously, at the minimum 2.5 by 5 should be there. I don't know why we're going lower, and again, there's no demonstration that the parking spaces the required number of parking spaces could fit in to those sizes, but I really do think we should be keeping to our current minimum standards, not outdated minimum standards. They are the 2 major points I'd like to raise. The other one I would like to just query is about the bin storage. I'm sure Councillor Steptoe will advise me on this if no one else can. I couldn't see a point. Can we have clarification where the bins will be, if it's going to be in the main bin storage, or they've got their separate one? It is, so the bin storage will contain the bins for all flats and the 2 bungalows, and that bin storage is within the minimum distance
Chairman,
of the entry point for the refuse vehicle.
Yes, Chairman, but the communal area there is for the flats. Obviously, the houses having their own amenity space, they'd be able to have their own bin storage in their own gardens.
They can and there is room in the gardens for their bins.
Yes, Chairman, you can see the space that there is.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I can see space, but I just wanted to know that that has been thought of and where they're keeping it. And that takes me back to the point. There is a minimum distance which I did not have time to look up. One is I want to know, does the refuse vehicle go down the side access to collect the bins, or do they walk up to get the bins? There is a minimum distance that they're expected to walk, so I want clarification around that. If the bungalows are that much, the bungalows are further away than the existing bin storage and the proposed bin storage, and I'd just like clarification around that. Thank you.
Obviously, because you're, as the referring ward member, obviously you haven't got a chance to come back, so are you just happy with what you've said? Yeah. Yeah, okay. Right, thank you. Councillor Weston.
Thank you, thank you, Chairman. I want to go, this is one probably for the solicitor. The resident said there was there's a dispute between the boundaries at 149 and 147. I'm a bit concerned on this because if there is a dispute of the boundary, as a district, are we correct in allowing an application to go through if we say yes? Or should we not be refusing this on this basis until that is sorted? Sorry, just a question.
Yeah, I can recall this one quite clearly from training. The principle of whether something can happen, the planning application, is irrespective of who owns the land. It's the principle of whether that can happen that we're discussing. Who actually owns the land, boundary disputes, that's a separate issue, not part of the application tonight. So, in answer to your question, it's not relevant to what we're discussing.
Sorry, Chairman, I don't understand that, because if we're discussing
ultimately,
land
if
between one
if
another,
you don't own the land, you can't develop on it.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. There's a
to be
dispute
seen
on the land
outside.
now. So if we say yes to it and he doesn't own the land and it's
Yeah.
not and it goes through, are we not as a district?
No.
Okay, thank you.
If you don't own it, you can't do it. It's planning law. Councillor Mrs Hoy.
Yeah, the only thing I'd like to know, well, if it's 145 to 149 and they submitted the planning application from 145 to 149, yeah, sort of thing, but surely the paperwork's wrong then because they don't own 149.
That's not quite how it works, but Councillor, Mr Stranksall.
Chairman, if I may, I think the inclusion of 149 could actually be our error. When we identify sites, we go to BLPU dots, and I think because of the history and the site and that, I think we may have inadvertently included number 149. The site is number 147, and the applicants have certified the ownership between the two properties. So there may be some issues, you heard, raised by third parties, and as the Chair has clarified, if you get planning permission, you can't build that permission if you don't own the full extent of the site. You need the consent of the landowner. But the applicants, it seems from the application forms, have identified the site to be 145 and 147 and served notice on number 147. Whether there is in reality some sort of encroachment of boundaries, including number 149, as you've heard, I can't clarify further for you.
Have we got an answer for the bin distance?
Sorry. The guidance that you refer to is 25 metres for the collection. This is some 46 metres or so. So the site occupiers would have to put their bins out to a reception area for the operatives to collect and empty the bins.
Councillor Hookway.
Thank you, Chairman. Your answer to that last question gives me a question. You say that there's a parking space allocated to the front of the flats. Well, surely that if there is a requirement for residents to put their bins out so that the bin operatives can collect them, that parking space will be irrelevant because they'll be using it as a bin collection area.
Bins go on the highway, not on the site.
Another question that I originally was thinking about, did you state that there was a couple of parking spaces which were for disability? Is it intended for these bungalows to be for people with disabilities?
Chairman, I don't think they're designed specifically for people with disabilities in terms of like wet room, bathrooms and purpose-made facilities. I say in the report what the applicant has said in their submissions, that they anticipate, they don't know, but they anticipate that in a sort of a quiet setting at the back here, the disabled spaces were put in because they anticipate these buildings might be attractive to either elderly people or people with disabilities because of their suitability to that market. But we can't say who would take those units. On car parking, the applicant has clarified that in the management of the site, each site occupier would be dedicated one space. So there'd be 10 of the spaces given over to one each to all the households. That would leave 4 as a casual visitor parking, surplus capacity, etc., if that helps, Chairman.
Councillor Wilson, you wanted to...
Thank you, Chairman. Could I just refer to the diagram in front of us? Is there actually a physical boundary for the shared amenity area, which is on the top of the diagram there, and then you've got the area to the left of it? So is there actually some sort of physical boundary? Because that's a shared area. And a sort of supplementary question to that is, with the figures, the calculations that have been made for the amenity area, does that include the new flat that's being built?
Chairman, there's boundary demarcation on this plan submitted before you here and through the middle of the site here, giving 2 private amenity areas that have been described to you in the report. My eyes aren't good enough to see if there's a demarcation there. It probably wouldn't be because there's landscaping and then it's a communal area. The 8th flat, your amenity space policies allow for a balcony, and there is a balcony feature detail in there, so that doesn't need the reliance. It's been approved anyway with the balcony, but it doesn't need reliance on that space.
Okay. Okay, Councillor Cannell.
Thank you, Chair. Just a point on the parking space sizes. If we were to remove the 4 visitor spaces, would there be enough space for 10, correct? Or 2 policy-sized spaces? Or has that been thought of?
Chairman, the initial layout that you saw that the applicant put in obviously relied on more land that they felt they could provide in there. So if you was to condition a consent to say you want the car parking spaces to be that 200 mil wider and 100 mil longer, sorry, the other way around, 100 mil wider and 200 mil longer, they could probably get that compliance in there. It's how that might ultimately impact upon the overall amenity provision, particularly if you was thinking of the way it works out. Because the point I make in the report is members are right, we have standards and things wouldn't improve if it didn't move on. The problem you've got is being considered reasonable. If you were to refuse permission on that basis, would a government inspector, as we suspect, come into the site and see that the car parking spaces that were approved were to a certain size? Okay, things move on. But is it reasonable, rather than just for its own sake in this case, on this site, to require the larger space? It would definitely be beneficial to the users, but is it something that makes a difference between refusing planning permission and approving it? And on this occasion, officers have felt weighing that up because of the presence of the existing spaces and what an inspector might think. We don't know because we're not at an appeal, but we have to advise you on what the chances may be. And we felt strong enough that in this case, we should go with the size of the spaces that are submitted.
I think one of the other mitigating factors on the car parking spaces is that as you look at the plan, a good number of them are sort of end spaces where there is, although the actual marking of the bay is the lower size, they have got side space as well. So it's effectively a more usable area. Councillor Hockway, you want to come back on last thing?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I understand what our officer has expressed in relation to the parking spaces, but it's not just a case of vehicle sizes have got bigger generally, and we are also looking to help people with, the likelihood is that some of these properties be occupied with people who have young children, and the requirement for them to have access to their vehicles and be able to put young children into vehicles in a safe manner. I think it's appropriate that we look to try and meet our minimum standards. If it's a matter of adjusting the plan slightly to do that, then I think that's something that could be done by a condition without actually having to refuse the application in total.
Right, members, I think we've had a good debate at this point and covered the principles. There's a bit of an impasse over the parking standards, but we do have to bear in mind the standards that were applied at the application that does have approval. So we'll move to the vote on this. There's the recommendation printed on 9.1.18 going through to 9.1.20, the various conditions. Those members in favour of the approval, please indicate. Those against?
Can I have my vote voted against? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That item is approved. Thank you very much for your attendance this evening.